Good evening once again, ladies and gentlemen, and I welcome all of you back to another From Software OST reaction video, where tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I knew I had to talk about like Bloodborne eventually. I mean, out of all the games in the From Software series, a lot of people even still consider Bloodborne to be probably the very best. And the fact that it's like now approaching 10 years old in a matter of months is the sort of thing that makes you begin to realize that actually people might say it's the best video game possibly ever made. Well, okay, that's quite a bit of a stretch, but one thing that people do say a lot, considering the hype around Shadow of the Erdtree, is still very fresh, despite people not knowing what they're talking about, leaving what I can only best describe as very mixed and almost one-sided reviews about the Elden Ring DLC. But with that being said, the Old Hunters from Bloodborne is still regarded as the greatest DLC that has ever been released for a video game, because people almost say it's like when you get into like this part, it almost feels like you're playing a new game. It's like a second game entirely. And there are loads of like other things that happened, like how the story progresses, how the bosses become possibly even harder, which is technically how it's supposed to be. DLCs are normally supposed to be introduced after the main game has been released. So yes, of course, they probably had to make some things quite difficult. And again, it's just an extension of a game that people already loved, with more features added, more story, more arenas to explore. And then we come to the actual music side of things. And what I need to like really put together is that if you've never heard of Bloodborne or never seen just what terrors can behold you in such a game like this, well, that's why we also want to check out the first time you are introduced to Ludwig the Accursed, and then when we get to the Holy Blade section of the fight. So I need to wipe my nose, actually. That's what I need to do. Hang on 1 second. Here we go. So this is what happens when you are introduced to Ludwig.
Help us. Alongside this, the great terror looms. Have mercy. Have mercy upon us.
And yes, this is Ludwig, by the way. He is also the first boss of the DLC, and it is, well, it's like Godric the Grafted's sort of like abominable pet. Except this was 7 years before Elden Ring, so this was like a huge shock to the system. And then the music, the fight starts, as well as the music, and here it is. I just love the ghoulishness of just this choir building and building and building. It's very reminiscent of the Father Gascoigne boss fight, how everything was building and building and building. Like, if From Software were ever going to ever develop anything that had horror elements to it, this is exactly like the first thing that should come to mind. It is it builds like a horror like a horror video game. It really does. Except it's reliant on like Frankenstein-esque themes of science and people becoming gods. Themes that ironically are also in Bloodborne. Again, just the build, and then it sort of like stops and slows down for like a moment or two. And that's because of what happens later in this fight. Because for those who don't remember, this was the very first boss fight where if you got a boss down to half health, well, this is what happens. And bear in mind, this is the first time that From Software ever did this.
You were at my side all along. My true mentor, my guiding moonlight.
And I know I could talk about like the nuances about how this is like the first point in the if you like played Bloodborne and you fought Ludwig immediately like after you finished doing Murgo's Wet Nurse, this is like the first point in the story where you begin to realize that this used to be a human. He wasn't just some enchanted with something. It is absolutely meant to showcase the H.P. Lovecraft influences of men trying to transfigure themselves to become gods. And it's even more surprising when you see Ludwig literally yield the Moonlight Greatsword, a weapon that is in every single From Software game. And that's even the way it ends, is... It ends in... I mean, first of all, we could talk about the way it transitions to dun dun dun. It's because when Ludwig transitions and becomes the Holy Blade, he literally stands on his hind legs and almost fights like a giant, and becomes less frenzied than the sort of the anarchistic the way that Ludwig would attack you previously in the fight, which it really it's one of those fights that almost changes everything again, because now all of a sudden you're not fighting seemingly like a single boss character. You're fighting what used to be a boss character but now has morphed and evolved, and you have to change your style a little bit to be able to defeat him. Now, I know a lot of people say that perhaps maybe Ludwig is not even particularly difficult when he's transitioned into the Holy Blade, but the spectacle of fighting him and the way the music, it pitches to frenzied terror when you realize that what exactly you're fighting, and you understand how he is fighting and what this all means in the context of the story. It brings a certain level of clarification to your mind, and even if you still weren't sure what this game was even about, or what even the DLC was about, well, it almost comes to a head right there. And the fact that this is only just the first boss of the DLC, and you still got the Living Failures, Lady Maria, Lawrence, and then finally the Orphan of Kos to concern yourselves with, it literally couldn't go any easier or any harder. But my goodness, it turns this game from almost like savage frenzy and fights for survival into all of a sudden you want to succeed. It makes you almost a stronger person for doing it. And there's like almost an essay's worth of analysis to talk about with Bloodborne in terms of game design and everything else, but this still absolutely comes almost to being one of the very best. I can't tell you how much I can't get enough of it. It might even be possibly one of, it's probably maybe even on the same like tier as the likes of things like Dark Heat and Medea, and possibly even the Burnt Ivory King, but we'll see about that. And with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys have enjoyed this, and I cannot wait to see all of you guys again in the next video. Take care, and bye-bye for now.